and didn't stay around and take the names of all those members that wanted to get behind the youth exchange for 2019. I had a phone call from Tom Creed. Thank you very much, Tom. He's the first one to step up and say, I'll take a student. So if there is at least one more person in the room or a member that's not in the room, please get in touch with me after the meeting. President Phil, members and guests, it's my pleasure to introduce Mayor Richard Walton. Richard has served 4 terms, completing the 4th term actually in about 6 months' time. He tells me he's going to be enjoying yet another career after he finishes his term, yet to be determined. Very interesting. Mayor Richard advised me when we were chatting that he's now on about his 7th career. He taught at school for many years in North Vancouver. He's a chartered accountant and has been awarded the designation of FCPA, also the Queen's Jubilee Medal for Community Leadership. Richard's been mayor since 2005 and continues to be a director of the Board of Metro Vancouver, Econ 911, and the BC Municipal Finance Association. Mayor Walton has worked in senior financial and management positions in retail, manufacturing, and technology from 1989 to 1995. He owned and operated the largest video retail chain in Western Canada. Must have been a lot of fun, Richard. Never short for movies. And is deeply involved in BC sport and community volunteer. He's chaired the North Vancouver BC Games both in 1999 and 2003. Initiated and chaired the first World Mountain Bike Conference. And he's written over 200 articles and columns in newspapers and periodicals on diverse public policy issues, including transportation, climate change, risk management, and capital planning. In 2011, on behalf of North Vancouver District, he received the United Nations Saskatchewan Award for Disaster Risk Planning and Prevention. May I introduce Richard, and I'm sure we'll be in for an interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about mobility pricing, which is a concept that has been around for a long time in Europe. And really all mobility pricing means is an integrated approach to getting around within a city or community. And when I say integrated, I mean getting people around, tourists around, goods around. Very often we tend to look at transportation planning issues focusing on a particular segment of the population. And it's one of the challenges that I've been sort of wrestling with for almost 15 years in elected office right now, how to provide a sort of greater synergy. In my younger years, not in the what was just read by Kendall, I spent 7 or 8, actually it was 8 summers working as a tour guide and driver in Europe and North Africa. So I've been through most of the cities of Europe, and I've seen the ones that have probably had a modicum of good planning in the early years and the ones that don't. And the city I'm most familiar with in Europe, apart from my own origins, which is Manchester, is Stockholm. So what I'm going to do is just start out giving you, it's about a 6-minute video of the Stockholm congestion pricing model that is often quoted. And I spent parts of 2 years I spent in Stockholm about 10 years ago. And had lengthy conversations with the mayor, with IBM, who developed most of the software, with traffic folks, academics, and taking a look at the Swedish system. Now, hopefully this will come forward with the English language. It sounds a little bit like the annoying IKEA ad man, but I'm hoping this sound system is good enough. If not, it gets into pricing and it gets into a series of issues that are very germane to my 10 or 15 minutes of comments afterwards. So sit back and relax, and hopefully you can hear it. So. Thanks.
The Stockholm region is expanding and new residential districts are being created. Today, the population of Stockholm is around.
That's Carolyn's music, I think.
just lost the voice.
It's a music video.
Voice is definitely there. We'll get it back in a second, but I will just comment that Stockholm is this city in the world that's probably most like Vancouver, if you take a look at it geographically compared with everywhere else. And they have a downtown area which is about the same size as the city of Vancouver, and then they have suburbs that almost equal the population of Vancouver if you add them all together. So if you look at the Stockholm experience, it's actually quite germane to the kind of challenges we have with the bridges and the islands, etc. So what they attempted to do in Stockholm was to try and figure out how to solve the congestion problem in and out of downtown Stockholm. Now the challenge is a little bit different, as I'll show in a few minutes. We don't have the same problem anymore getting in and out of downtown. Sorry, I should be using. We don't have the same problem getting in and out of downtown Vancouver only the way we used to when I was a kid growing up on the North Shore. Lionsgate Bridge was about the only plugged bridge back in the late 50s. But what's happened in the time since is that we've got about 12 major congestion points throughout Metro Vancouver where the traffic sort of narrows. So what's the approach? Are we any? Well, I've got the DVD right here. If you want to put the DVD in, I always bought the backup. The challenge they were facing in Stockholm then was how to discourage people from bringing their cars through the pinch points. And they realized that this was going to be quite controversial because Stockholmers love their cars just like people in Metro Vancouver. The advantage they had, though, is that Stockholm has a history of very, very progressive town planning going back to the 1940s. They didn't have to fight a war and, of course, and build themselves out of the kind of devastation that most English cities, for example, experience, or they weren't completely driven by the U.S. highway system and Canadian building highway system after World War II that resulted in all the freeways we have today. So they were able to retrofit some ideas a little more easily than we did. So the challenge they had in Stockholm was how do you try and reduce the number of cars going in and out of the downtown area from all of these points without it simply being another tax grab. And they realized very quickly that the only way they could do that was to make sure that there was something in it for everybody within Stockholm. If you bring in any kind of thing that people will have to pay more for, and it's punitive to some people and not punitive to others, then people raise the fairness card. And that fairness card, of course, came up in Vancouver recently during the traffic referendum, and it came up again in the last election when both parties pledged within a week of each other to remove the tolls from the Port Manly Bridge in terms of regional fairness. Are we back again?
We
All right.
might have a solution, yeah.
We might have a solution.
I would need your microphone, is that okay? Or once the video is playing?
No, you take my phone.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
The Stockholm region is expanding, and new residential districts are being created. Today, the population of Stockholm is around 1.2 million, and is getting larger by some 20,000 people every year. This means more traffic, for which there are only a limited number of access roads and bridges. Not only does this affect the flow of traffic in and around Stockholm, it also brings environmental problems in the form of noise and emissions. One way of improving the traffic flow and the environment is by introducing a congestion tax. The basic idea is that owners of vehicles have to pay in order to enter or leave the inner city of Stockholm. The revenues from the system are then used to finance investments in the road network in the Stockholm region. In 2006, a congestion tax was introduced for a trial period known as a full-scale trial in Stockholm. Following a referendum held at the time of the general election in 2006, it was decided to reintroduce the congestion tax on the 1st of August 2007. Under the scheme, vehicle owners have to pay to drive in and out of the inner city zone on weekdays between 6:30 in the morning and 6:30 in the evening. No tax is charged on public holidays, on the day before a public holiday, or in July. The congestion tax affects only vehicles registered in Sweden, and it's levied when they pass one of the 18 control points. The Swedish Road Administration has the task of administering the congestion tax system and is also responsible for providing information to the public. The aim is to make everyone who drives a Swedish registered vehicle in Stockholm aware of the tax and how to pay it. This has meant extensive information activities throughout Sweden, using many different channels of communication. There has also been intense media coverage. Creating and administering the congestion tax system has meant a big challenge for the Swedish Road Administration. It employed the services of IBM Sweden, which designed a sophisticated technical system. Vehicles are identified automatically by cameras, which take a photo of their number plates. The driver has no need to stop at a control point, and the flow of traffic is not affected. The actual congestion tax amount is displayed on an overhead sign at each control point, 10, 15 or 20 Swedish krona, depending on the time of day. The highest amount charged is during peak hour traffic. The maximum amount payable per vehicle and day is 60 krona.
$15.
If the system is unable to read a number plate recorded by a camera, the photo is sent to customer service, where it's identified manually. Overnight, the accumulated passages made by any vehicle during a particular day are aggregated into what's called a tax decision. This tax decision is then available the next day on the website of the Road Administration, in Pressbyrån or 7-Eleven convenience stores, and at customer service. The simplest way to pay the congestion tax is by direct debit, which is the method chosen by most people. You can set up a direct debit on the Swedish Road Administration website or at customer service.
Det dras 10-12 dagar efter passage.
In addition to paying by direct debit, it's also possible to pay at a bank, online, or over the counter at any Pressbyrån or 7-Eleven store in Sweden. The owner of the vehicle is responsible for seeing that payment is made into the Swedish Road Administration's congestion tax account, not later than 14 days after the vehicle has passed a control point. On the Swedish Road Administration website, it's easy to view your congestion tax decisions, paid as well as unpaid. No charge is made for driving through Stockholm via Essingeleden, and motorists on their way to or from Lidingö are not charged if they drive through the congestion tax zone within 30 minutes and pass one of the control points at Ropsten. Certain vehicles are also exempt, such as emergency vehicles, buses, green cars, and motorcycles. The congestion tax was introduced for a trial period of 7 months in 2006. During this Stockholm trial, there was an increase in public transport and more park and ride areas were provided as an alternative to using one's car. During the trial, the volume of traffic and air pollution was reduced, results which were repeated in the first few months after the reintroduction of the congestion tax in 2007.
film is dated. A lot of this technology now, because of course we all have the experience with the Port Mann Bridge and Golden Ears, and actually it's moved along considerably from this in terms of cost coming down, etc. But this one was the one that was sort of first introduced. This one and the one in Oslo that were first introduced that got people thinking about it. And what it involves is a significant shift from what we've been thinking about for probably since World War II, which is simply spending a lot of money and building additional road capacity. And we build it, build it, build it. What this does is the first transportation system that started saying we got to look at the demand side. We simply can't keep building freeways and encouraging people to drive cars because we simply cannot build your way out of congestion. There's no city in the world that is still trying to build itself out of congestion. I think the last one was Beijing, and I'm sure many of you have been to Beijing. I remember flying in there about 10 years ago, and I flew over, as coming to the airport, I flew over this perfect interchange and this outer ring road. It was ring road number 7, and there was no traffic on it. There were no buildings anywhere near it. But the city had been built well in advance to anticipate all the cars that were coming. And I think even in China, where they're able to make decisions, change major policy quickly, they've made significant policy changes even within the last few years since I've been there. So what is it that's magical about this? Well, it's a tax grab. I mean, I can be cynical. I can tell you what 90% of my residents say. It's just a tax grab. You're just trying to get more money out of my pocket. So what's the value proposition? I've spent years, like many of you, pounding the streets looking for venture capital money for companies. What is the value proposition of this? Well, the Swedes were very clear about it. They said that what you're trying to do is it's buying you time. Why would you want to pay up to 60 krona per day unless there was a value proposition for you? So what happened? When they introduced this system, they didn't have a referendum before it. They had a referendum a year after it. So the system was completely implemented. Everybody had a chance to see the impact it had on their lives. And then at the end of that time period, they had a chance to vote. And they voted not unanimously in Stockholm. It's a very much like Metro Vancouver, 22 communities. Stockholm, I think, has 23. Downtown Stockholm thought it was great because it took the traffic away. They voted in favor of it, but they were large enough, they were the gorilla, that virtually every one of the suburbs around voted against it. Not dramatically, but more than 50%. But you added all the votes together, and it was like 51%, and they kept it. And they've done the same thing in Oslo. When they introduced theirs about 10 years ago, they did the same thing, and it passed. They took another referendum just a year ago, I believe, in Oslo, 10 years later, to see if people wanted to keep it, and the percentage went up. People recognized the fact that what this did is, at the time when most people wanted to get through those congested areas, what it did, all you have to do is just shift maybe 10 to 15% of the traffic out of that congested time. And if you think of the number of people going over in single occupancy vehicles who could, if there were a cost attached to it, could carpool with their neighbor, could go over the yard workers of the Port Mann just before 7 o'clock in the morning instead of at 7:20, take public transit, any number of these different options. If you just get one in every 7 or 8 cars that will take advantage of that, you free up the capacity, which will likely remove the congestion. And I know from having looked at Ironworkers Bridge, for example, over the years, and talked with the ministry officials, all it takes is a slight change in demand within the region, and all of a sudden a bridge that was flowing fairly steadily, maybe slowing down, but flowing steadily, can come to a grinding halt. And the kind of situation we've seen in North Vancouver, where every day the traffic in the afternoon is now backed up to Lonsdale. That didn't happen 5 years ago. It wasn't there. What happened was what related to Port Mann. What happened at Port Mann is that literally the moment that the bridge was widened to those 8 lanes, or 9 lanes, even with tolls, what happened is that all of a sudden the North Shore came within reach for people to take jobs there. My son-in-law has his principal business in Squamish, and he lives in Langley. All of a sudden he could get crews up to Squamish and West Vancouver and Squamish corridor. And all of a sudden, because of the additional road capacity there, more people started hitting the roads. And what happened, literally the next day, it was a week after Labor Day, that first line up to Lonsdale happened, because all those folks were then coming home at the end of the day with their crews, etc. Use my son-in-law again as an example of what happened in September, when both, I'm trying to think exactly when it was, when the tolls came off of Port Mann. When was that? That was within, I think it was last September, wasn't it, roughly? Yeah.
I think around an election.
Yeah, that's right. It was 3 months after the election, after both parties in the election said they're going to remove the tolls from Port Mann. Well, what happened is, and my son-in-law again, resident in Langley, he found that instead of having to leave home at 6:30 in the morning, pay the toll with 3 guys in the car, work up the corridor. All of a sudden, his economics completely changed because he had to leave at 5:30 in the morning, an hour earlier, to get over the Port Mann. So, he lives in the area, and when he was listening to politicians talking about fairness, first question that came up with him is, well, fairness to whom? I'm a business guy. And I recognize the fact that I was paying that toll, but the amount of time, the time value it gave him, made it possible for him to bid on jobs competitively in other parts of Metro Vancouver. So when you're talking about critical concepts such as fairness, you have to really define what the context of that fairness is. Now I'm going to run through some slides quickly because I lost 5 or 10 minutes, unfortunately, that technical thing in front, and then throw it open to questions. Okay. The first one is, these are complex issues, the increase of traffic in Metro Vancouver. Any of you here from the North Shore are well aware of the fact that we have an increase of 1,000 people between the ages of 20 and 45 who are working on the North Shore, more than we had in the last census, which means the critical age and now moving into all of those service jobs are now commuting in greater numbers to the North Shore. It's related to housing costs. And now we've got a challenge where our Chamber of Commerce is very concerned because we've now got a lot of folks, including North End District Hall, who are now taking the jobs in their 20s and 30s. They're taking those jobs, but the housing costs are too high in the North Shore, and they've got traffic to deal with. We're starting to lose employees who can't cope with the traffic and can't afford to live in North Vancouver. So we've got issues, sociological factors, more complex issues that are now coming into play. We've got also the CTV did the provocative kind of television series, I think in the fall that probably most of us saw. It talked about the growing congestion. We're trying to put more and more people through the existing road corridors. It's simply not an option to stop the city growing because the national immigration policies are very much a part of the growth in the city of Vancouver. Put your hand up in the room if you are not an immigrant. Put your hand up if you're not an immigrant. If you're not, if you were born and raised here or whatever, you don't come from somewhere else, well, you look at the room, I mean, more than half of us came from somewhere else. That pattern is not going to change. And not only that, but the demographics show that we critically need those younger families and need people coming in to keep our economy vibrant. And the North Shore is really suffering right now, I can tell you, because our younger generation between 20 and 45 moved out after high school and they can't afford to come back. And it's having a significant impact on our regional job market. So, mobility pricing, I brought that expression back to Metro Vancouver from I did a couple presentations for TransLink about 8 years ago at the World Urban Transit Conference in Geneva. I came back and it was the head of the London Transit System who said, Richard, you've got to start talking about mobility pricing. You can't just deal with roads. You've got to deal with an integrated approach to the entire system like they do in Los Angeles and New York and London. Because what you've got to do, you've got to provide people options. If you're going to ever go and ask people, for example, for a congestion charge, you need to tell them exactly where the money's going from and you need to provide them options. In Stockholm, the congestion charge that you just saw, 50% of that went, the profit, net profit, after the cost of running the system. 50% went to complete the ring road around Stockholm for the car drivers, so they had options apart from going through downtown, and 50% went to improve transit within the region. Every nickel of that went back into the system after the operating cost. So it's not a tax grab, it's a reinvestment automatically, a little bit like the approach to carbon tax in a sense, which came in as having a neutral impact. So what is a Mobility Pricing Independent Commission? Well, I've delivered this lecture to a couple of cabinet ministers recently. It is an independent group of people. I was on the interviewing committee and interviewed them all as part of a group. It was Jeff Meggs, who's now the NDP Chief of Staff. Jeff was on the committee. Malcolm Brodie, Mayor of Richmond, was also on it, and John Cote, Mayor of Westminster. And what we tried to do is find about 14 people who represented labor, business, all the geographical regions that they lived in throughout Metro Vancouver, and brought to the table an understanding and knowledge of the challenges from the region. And what we did is said to them, review the literature, take a look at everything that's being done, everything that works, and then come back and write a report, non-politically driven report, that you can provide to all three levels of government, federal government, provincial, and Metro Vancouver regional mayors and councils, that will basically say, is there anything in these broader approaches to dealing with our transportation congestion that makes sense in the region? And the three goals of mobility pricing are obviously to reduce traffic congestion, which, as I mentioned, can't always be done just by building capacity. Second is to support the transportation investment of the right, which I talked about, reinvesting any of these funds right back into alternative modes of transportation, and promoting fairness. We hear loud and clear from Mayor Jackson and in Delta and others that this ongoing sense of TransLink not treating all regions fairly, of that investment not being fairly distributed. There has to be a sense of fairness. Both premiers in the outgoing and the ingoing of the last election, they talked about removing the tolls from the Port Man because people south of the Fraser thought they were being treated unfairly. If they'd asked me and many people I know in the North Shore, we would have said we would think we've died and gone to heaven to have a new bridge replacing the ironworkers with an extra 4 lanes. And will we be prepared to pay for it? Did you ever ask us? So when we see, for example, folks south of the river who have 2 bridges, that ultimately will they have to pay for it? Yes. But ultimately now that those tolls have been taken off, everybody's paying for them. They're being paid for out of general revenue of the province. And as a result, the whole impact of those bridges being part of mobility pricing, shaping demand, is completely gone. My son-in-law is back, I said, leaving an hour earlier every day and taking an hour later to get home when he comes back because there's no incentive for people not to drive over those bridges in rush hour. The congestion points within Metro Vancouver, I think you're well aware of where they are. So it's not just the Lionsgate Bridge, which was the main point in the 1950s. It's all those critical points. It's not that unlike Stockholm. But the challenge is if you want to implement any kind of fair regional approach to it. I always talk to my friend Greg Moore, who's mayor out in Poco out here. You know, Greg can drive out to UBC and back and not pay a nickel under if he just toll bridges and things. That's not fair within Metro Vancouver. Somebody who lives in Norgate here and works downtown goes through a 2-zone fare and they're only in transit for 8 minutes. That's not fair according to somebody who lives there. So in order to introduce any kind of mobility pricing system throughout the region, you have to recognize the fact that we are a city that depends upon bridges and tunnels. And what we have to do is come up with some kind of a system that evens out, if you like, those inconsistencies. You should not be able to drive from Maple Ridge to UBC without paying a nickel when somebody crosses the Port Man and pays it. So you have to figure out what fairness actually means. Again, the work done by the Mobility Pricing Commission a couple of months ago, they sent out a whole series of questions to people in the region. Are you frustrated with the traffic delays? Of course, 89%. Are you frustrated with the unpredictability of travel times? Yes, 80%. Why it's not 89, I'm not quite sure, but you know, it's still high. 81% say transportation costs them lost time each week, but as soon as you start talking about solutions that may cost people money, only 62% think it's a good idea to study ways to change mobility pricing within the region. So obviously politically it's immensely price sensitive. You've seen provincial governments, both NDP and Liberal, have moved away from election times for any kind of thing that's going to, you know, and the election, if you're reading as I am, the book right now, it's just been out a week on the BC politics in the last 7 years, you know that the probably any kind of additional tax related to transportation can kill a party at election time. So this issue isn't going away. So the 3 key issues, valid things that the mobility pricing is looking at are fairness, affordability, and accessibility. And the challenge we have going forward is that it's a political hot potato within the region. You know, you announce big bridges and people vote for you. If you announce demand management pricing approaches such as mobility pricing, which ultimately costs the taxpayer a lot less in the long run because you know what it costs to build a bridge, you know, $3 to $4 billion. Right now it's all political. There's not a lot of common sense, if you like, and a good engineering costing strategy behind it. So I think I'll stop talking there. The last comment I'll make is that this mobility pricing report coming out in June, as I explained to Minister Trevina 2 weeks ago, is there to elevate the level of public knowledge and understanding within this region. It's not meant as an advocacy tool. It will not be used in the municipal elections. It's meant to try and have everybody, including government decision makers, a better understanding of the issues and risks. So I'll stop there. I know there's a hand back there and there's one up here, so maybe the gentleman in the back.
So when will the SkyTrain reach North Vancouver?
I'll speak to you as a CPA, as a financial guy, never. Because none of the official community plans on the North Shore are bringing enough population that the densities are there to justify the cost. That's a hard business.
Does that generate that density?
Well, I can tell you that you want to increase, right now North End District, my community is the second slowest growing community in the Lower Mainland after West Van. And if I try to change my official community plan, we're going into that in the next couple of years with the new mayor, we're going to have a hope of being elected because people are pushing back on density. They want transportation first, and then they'll take the density. And you know what? In a world scarce resources like we live in, it's not going to happen. B-line buses and all kinds of other peripheral improvements, but not SkyTrain. Yes, sir.
Your Worship, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it. I appreciate your comments, but something always bothers me about new taxes. And I don't care what you want to call it. It's a tax. Make it fair. Don't be prejudiced. Don't discriminate. The people in Kelowna, they got a $20 million new bridge. Who's paying? Me. I'm going to pay to come across the Port Man. I want them to pay in Kelowna as well. Make it for British Columbia, because we have an a province-wide network of roads and bridges. Everybody pays.
You're absolutely bang on, sir. That's exactly the concern that the politicians deal with. It's that sense of fairness. And if you apply that sense of fairness just to people living in Surrey or whatever, you'll get that. The people of Surrey were paying for that bridge, and they were paying for it. And the reward they were getting was in terms of more time in their day, not sitting in congestion. But the inequities through you nailed it. You're absolutely right.
You got a new job, so I'm going to be your secretary. You're going to go
Those
on
reaches there, Joe.
balls.
Yes, sir. And then over here, yeah.
I'm never cynical, so. But we already have mobility pricing. It's called those goddamn gas taxes that are ridiculous and.
Sure.
And I'm sure Mr. Meggs and Mr. Cote, the left arms of the left wing, aren't going to throw those away and start.
Well, gas tax makes no sense at all. And you know that from the last Olympics. The Olympic Committee did such a good job of scaring people out of their cars because of the traffic jams that were coming, that transportation ridership went up, which is good, and it's never really come down from the Olympics. But gas consumption went down within the region. Well, when gas consumption goes down, gas tax revenue for TransLink goes down. So what happened is we got a whole bunch of people on the buses, so the fare revenue portion went up. Gas tax came down. So the more people who get out of their cars, the less funding TransLink gets. And that's what you call a regressive tax, and you're absolutely right. The best thing to do is get rid of gas tax completely. Because if you're relying on it, it's
way more or less cynical if we did that.
Yeah, no, I'm
agreed.
But you're right. You're absolutely right with the economics on that. Yes.
Question, please.
Sorry, I want to look at it from a business point of view. Shipping will likely go up, and not because it's costing them less or more, but because it's a hard cost to them rather than a soft cost,
Right.
which could be labor. Are the consumers also going to pay for that on top of the tax?
Well, it's a great point because it's one of those policy decisions that any city that's introducing mobility pricing would bring. You may decide, for example, the government can say that commercial traffic is free. What you're trying to do is free up road space with single occupancy vehicle cars, get people to not all be in single occupancy vehicle cars so there's more room for goods movement. Because if you can get, my son-in-law's a classic example. He just wants to get through quickly because he's paying guys per hour sitting in the car.
That's all it'll be.
Absolutely. So the intent is where the changes in behavior are likely going to be are with people who can carpool or can do these things, but they choose not to. Because it's more convenient for them to sit in. They're not paying anything. They can phone, do their mail, do your paper, listen to the radio, whatever. And ultimately, it's those folks you've got to change. All you need is probably in North Vancouver or North Shore is 8% of the traffic going over the iron workers in the morning just to disappear at peak time, which means through other ways of getting there. And that backlog in the morning would be gone overnight. They proved it in Stockholm.
We don't we're at the end of our time, but when do you think we'll have some decision on mobility pricing, or what's the time frame? You said a report in June.
Yeah, the report comes out in June. I'm the eternal optimist, but I would say you're likely never going to see it in Metro Vancouver, because I don't think anyone at the provincial level has either of the main parties have the will to drive this thing through. But I'm going to keep speaking and keep driving it through because there is no other solution. We can't keep taxing you guys to build $4 billion bridges, throw more cars on that are going to plug up the next day anyway. the poor man is not plugged again. Well, that worked, didn't it? So, you know, I'm cynical. I don't think you'll ever see it, but we have to get it on the table, and we have to talk about it, because somebody at some point is going to